So I will begin with, I had to look up the English for the term Tseruf Mikrim, which means, now I had the word coincidence. I don't know if it was a coincidence, but, you know, I've mentioned a few times having bumped into Natan Sharansky on the street, on Emek Rafaim, and that I have approached him, and he's been very, very gracious. And sometimes I have thought that I've approached him and said hello because I will then say, you know, I'm a friend of Stan and Debbie Solomon. So that could explain that, though there is this presence, a small presence, but he is quite a presence. So in December 2020, I was at the Super Sol supermarket on Agron. That's going toward town. And it was very shortly after Jonathan Pollard and his wife, Zichrono Livracha, had arrived. Now, I don't know him, and I didn't know anybody to say I'm a friend of, but I went over to him and to her, welcoming them. And last week, Esther passed away. And I was watching a clip of him sitting Shiva. And you only see a small room with a few people there, and he's sitting, but facing him, you see Natan Sharansky standing, and with the green cap that I've always seen him in. And Jonathan shares that 2 minutes before she took her last breath, she said two things with a weakened voice, but she said, I had two challenges, and that's why I lived. First, to free you and bring you home. And the second challenge was to bring you home as a Jew. And she says, the easier challenge was freeing you. And then, because she was rather observant, seeing you come home as a Jew and us coming to Israel, I can now go. And he said, she closed her eyes right after that. And as you're watching, that enough would have been moving. But I'm looking at this Jonathan Pollard. People have different feelings about all his actions, but still someone, a presence. And I'm looking at Natan, looking at him, and you see Natan wiping away tears. So I observed that, and certainly with Sharansky, feeling that I've been in the presence of heroes, and that's why I share this today. But the coincidence is we're talking about two men and their wives, to be honest, both of them, who are great. And may Natan have many, many more years, and Jonathan. And then I happened to read a post by a major general in the reserves in Tzahal, Doron Almog. And he says that he's been thinking this week, as it is the 15th anniversary of his son's death. His son, Aaron, was 23 when he died. There were complications, but for those 23 years, he was severely, severely autistic. And he says, this major general, as if he's speaking to Aaron, he says, you know, your grandparents, Aaron, I grew up with them, and they educated us to believe that the only way we'll survive in the Middle East is if we have power and if we're strong, the afpam lo bochim, and that never, but never should we ever cry. And then suddenly you, Aaron, come into the world to explain, as if you're here to explain to me that the weak also have a significant role to play in this world. It's as if you're saying to me, Dad, without understanding the weak, you can never be a mensch, a ben adam. And he said, this is what inspired me, because he is a force in this area, to not only open a rehabilitation for people like Aaron, but also to fight for severely handicapped who can function on one level, for them to come into the workforce and to play the significant roles that they can play. And so I thought, as I said, an interesting coincidence of these types of individuals, all of whom make up our world. So I would like today, in talking about Sarah and Avraham, to teach the texts regarding them according to Dr. Rosenak's approach that we tried to explain last week. So that means there will be deep delving, there'll be honesty, and there will be, what kind of questions? Anybody remember the word? I'm sharing my screen. Ultimate questions. Okay. Now, to get us started, please follow this first text very, very carefully. Now, anything I put on the board, of course, I want you to follow, but I say that every now and then, because in particular, and I want you to have, as I'm reading it, in mind the following question: what is the most important phrase in this short text? So Rosenak writes, throughout the millennial, the children of Abraham and Sarah, that's you and me, have themselves become parents and grandparents, not only transmit, but also do literature, create, that expands on and sometimes reshapes what those primary parents represent. As a result of their own experience and reflection, they discuss who Abraham and Sarah must have been, and even argue about what constitutes a good and loyal son or daughter of Sarah and Abraham. Which phrase do you think, or which phrase do you think I think is the most significant there? If you need to, read it again.
I think the relationship between Sarah and Abraham.
We will definitely talk about that. That's not what I was thinking. Anybody else?
I think it's the children's interpretation. The fact that they pass along their values, but it's also interpreted through each generation.
Okay, so Brenda, you're putting that into your own words. What I was looking at, as a result of their own experience, that is going to impact, yes, Brenda, on the way they interpret or the way they understand.
Yeah.
I believe that that is crucial. Please mute yourself. Okay. Now I bring this as an introduction, but also because I am willing to bet that we are going to see things regarding Avraham and Sarah differently because of our individual experiences and mindsets. Okay? and we will share those. Now, these are 3 questions to get us going. Sarah and Avraham set an example as a couple and as parents. How? What would we want our students to think of when they think of Avraham and Sarah, our students, our children? And what kind of father was Avraham? Now, I'm sure you've already had thoughts in response to those questions that you should keep in mind through the evening, through the afternoon. But these are 3 questions that Rosenak definitely wants us to ask. So, who is Sarah? From the Midrash. And keep in mind here, what characteristics, and I believe there are 4, do we see her that commentators have said define Sarah? Remember, Isaac marries Rivka and he brings her to Sarah's tent, though Sarah is no longer there. And Isaac brought her into the tent of Sarah, his mother. All the days that Sarah was alive, a cloud was connected, tied to the entrance of her tent. When she died, the cloud stopped, resting at her tent. And when Rebecca came, the cloud returned. The cloud is meant to have an image, not so much of God being there, but of modesty. Her not being out in the open. All the days that Sarah was alive, the doors were open wide. When she died, the wideness stopped. And when Rebecca came, the wideness returned. And all the days that Sarah was alive, there was a blessing in her dough, challah. And when Sarah died, that blessing ended. When Rebecca came, the blessing of the dough returned. All the days that Sarah was alive, there was a candle that would burn from Shabbat Eve to the next Shabbat Eve. And when she died, the candle stopped burning for so long. And when Rebecca came, the week-long flame of the candle returned. And as soon as Isaac saw her, that she did the deeds of his mother, separating her challah in purity and separating her dough in purity, he brought her into the tent. So what 4 characteristics do we see here? I mentioned one already, modesty, tzniut. What else?
Hospitality.
Hospitality, generosity, with the doors open. What does the challah, the dough, represent?
Ocean.
Somebody, I didn't hear you. I think somebody said, what does the challah represent? Okay, blessing and filling the house with blessings. And what's the 4th? What is the symbolism in the candle burning from one Shabbat Eve all the week long to the next? That's meant to symbolize, the candle burns forever. She doesn't rest, that she was very diligent. Okay.
To me, it represents consistency.
Okay. I was just going to say the dough could also represent the consistency of the dough. Now, I want to ask you, because I'm assuming you know about Sarah, are you satisfied with presenting our matriarch in this way exclusively? Are there points, notes that you would feel you want to add on if you were teaching about her or transmitting to others what this matriarch is for us?
Well, I think most people will disagree with me. I think Sarah by saying that she's a sister and not a wife, to me, it's a righteous deed. It's a dika, what she's willing to sacrifice for her partner.
Okay, we are actually, I'm glad you're bringing that up, because I assumed somebody would later on. So quickly, that is an issue that some people don't understand how Avraham could have her lie if it was only to save his life. There are other commentaries about that. First of all, that she agreed, and because of the sister-wife relationship that occurred in those days, that it was justified. Okay, good. But, and that's what we are going to talk about, the type of relationship they have, and look at indications of what we will call a rather close, respectful relationship. Somebody else?
This doesn't speak to any of her flaws.
Okay, yeah. Are you going to list any, or are you just making that statement? Because that's what I was looking at, you know, that I was sure that nobody would just say, this says it all.
Well,
On the other hand, maybe it does. Marlene, did you want to add to that?
yeah, I don't know. Okay, the story of Hagar and Ishmael points her out to be at times a shrewish woman who had a place and wanted to maintain her place, and she could at times be even cruel, although in the end she was really looking out for the welfare of Isaac.
Okay, I'm glad you added that. Now, this is an example.
There's
and
another word,
and
ambitious, ambitious.
we are going to get to the text regarding that in a bit, but certainly that is an issue that many people have a problem with.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have another point, if I may.
Yes.
Generally, I look at Sarah and Abraham as a wonderful marriage, yet she complains that when he prayed to have a child, he prayed for himself. He never prayed for her.
Okay, interesting. And the only we see juxtaposed to that, that Isaac does pray with Rivka. Okay, now what you've just proven is exactly what Dr. Rosenak would want, that we also talk about the flaws, and we're going to look at now, but then we have to weigh, and we have to see, was it shrewish or perhaps something else? Okay, so let's continue. I want to look at Sarah more through her relationship with Avraham. So first of all, look at this text from Lech Lecha. And God said to Abraham, your wife Sarai, you shall not call her name Sarai anymore, for Sarah is her name. And I will bless her, and I will give you a son from her, and I will bless her, and she will become a mother of nations. Kings of nations will be from her. Most important about this text is that there is, in this name change, and also Avram to Avraham, it's a profound transformation, but it involved both of them equally. God is pointing that out, and I think we should not forget that. You know, we sometimes feel the woman's taking the back seat. Okay, and we're seeing that she's being told that she will have a son, and she will be, like Avraham, the Ima of the nations. Now, something else that talks of them being together. Commentators explain this. Now, Abraham and Sarah were old, and the Hebrew is much better, ba'im bayamim, coming on in years. Sarah had ceased to have the way of the women. The important phrase commentators will say, ba'im bayamim, is that they look at that first of all, rarely do you see any couples mentioned in that way, both the husband and the wife together? And ba'im bayamim, they visualize that Avraham and Sarah have gone through their entire lives through so much together. Now, something else. Text 5. And Abram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had acquired, and the souls that they had acquired in Haran, and they went to go to the land of Canaan. And they came to the land of Canaan. Now, something else that points to Sarah's ability, and them both being in this together, starting with this startup nation. What is the phrase? And they took with them et hanefesh asher asu, the souls that they had acquired. In the Hebrew, it says the souls that they had made. What is that referring to? That they already began their mission of teaching. And Rashi would tell you that Avraham succeeded in teaching many of the males, and Sarah did her job with the women. Something that they were doing separately, but the mission was as one. Now, let's look at this text a little longer. And keep in mind, as I'm reading it, what this text reveals, really reveals about Sarah. And Sarai said to Avram, behold, now the Lord has restrained me from bearing. Please come to my handmaid. Perhaps I will be built up from her. And Abram hearkened to Sarai's voice. So Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian, her handmaid, at the end of 10 years of Avram's dwelling in the land of Canaan, and she gave her to Abram, her husband, for a wife. And he came to Hagar, and she conceived, and she saw that she was pregnant. And her mistress now became unimportant in her eyes. And Sarai said to Abram, may my injustice be upon you. She's angry. I did this, and now I gave my handmaid into your bosom, and she saw that she had become pregnant, and I became unimportant in her eyes. May the Lord judge between me and you. And Abram said to Sarai, here is your handmaid in your hand. Do to her that which is proper in your eyes. And Sarai afflicted her, and she fled from before her. Now, as I asked, what does this reveal about Sarah? And let's not go to the next episode that was already mentioned. Just based on this.
She's human.
She's human, okay? We all are. Yes, beyond that.
She's angry and jealous.
Okay, and
Yeah.
that's why Esther's saying she's human. You would understand now.
But she also has the capacity to voice her opinion and let Abraham know how she's feeling.
Absolutely. And she's going to do that with the episode that you referred to before. What else? What else does it say about her?
She can be
The
violent.
suggestion that she made. Bev?
She can be violent. It says she afflicted her. So that indicates a certain amount of violence.
Well, that doesn't have to be violence. It could just be she was
Emotional.
doing something. Yeah, it doesn't have to be that she was violent. I'm
Bracha,
looking for something entirely different. Stan?
Bracha, did it maybe indicate that she was naive. She didn't realize what the consequences of her decision was, what it could become.
Yeah.
Okay,
I would
I-
say she's very, I don't know if self-sacrificing is the word. The idea is she's willing to give her handmaid to her husband. She's willing, that willingness to please her husband, to me, that's a very powerful image in her character. She couldn't have kids, but her handmaid probably could. So let my husband have her. I mean, what woman is going to say to, my husband, take my handmaid? Like that's incredibly of generous spirit, this woman.
I look at it as salt to injury. Not only was she expected to be like a surrogate mother, so not only that, but Hagar looked down at her and diminished her from what she was.
But she said to
It's mine.
Abraham,
I'm not.
do to her that which is proper in your
Other
eyes.
room if you want.
But Sarai is blaming Abraham.
Ugh.
hello?
Bracha, I think there is some women's equality in this section. When Sarah says to him, may the Lord judge between me and you, I think she sees herself standing on equal ground in front of God on the same level as Abraham.
Absolutely. And she's been given reason to feel that way, going back to what I said before. Her name was changed as well. Her name was changed as well. So she is an equal partner with Avraham in their lives and in the national mission that they have. Now, I think what Michael alluded to is very true. I'd like to phrase it a little differently. And maybe I should have asked, what she does say about her relationship with Avraham? Some feel that it indicates the deep sense of security and personal connection with her husband. What do I mean? You know that many women in those days, and the other matriarchs, felt that their reason for being was giving their husbands children. And they felt frightened or badly if they couldn't provide in that way. But Sarah was willing for Avraham to have children by another woman because she felt certain that the ties between Avraham and herself were not dependent merely on having children.
I agree.
That was very novel for those times. Now, it's also a twist because them having a child is crucial for this nation's future. She saw them, and I think Avraham saw them as well, themselves, as not so much as child bearers and raisers, but as a team intent on realizing a specific ideal, parenting a nation. Now, by the way, an aside, what really made Sarah jealous, before we get to the issue of Ishmael and Isaac, she felt when Hagar was despising her that maybe Hagar was stealing Avram's affections. Now, it's one thing. She would allow Hagar to be an instrument of procreation,
Right.
but she was not going to allow her the honor and the zchut, the privilege of being Avram's beloved wife companion. Very interesting. Now, let's come to the situation that has already been mentioned. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, making merry. And we're not exactly sure what that means, making merry, but something strong enough that causes Sarah to react. And Sarah said to Avraham, drive out. The strong words. Don't, ask them to leave. No, that's not what she says. Garesh, drive out this handmaid and her son. For the son of this handmaid shall not inherit with my son, with Isaac. But the matter greatly displeased Abraham. He's caught in between these two, perhaps more than two women, the two sons, concerning his son. And God said to Abraham, be not displeased concerning the lad and concerning your handmaid. Whatever Sarah tells you, hearken to her voice, for in Isaac will be called your seed. So again, support for Sarah having her place. God is even saying it. People think that Avram probably assumed that God would say to him, tell Sarah she's wrong. No. And that's significant. Isaac will be called your seed, but also the son of the handmaid I will make into a nation because he is also your seed. Okay, so now, does anybody else want to voice an opinion about this episode other than Marlene, who said two different things about it? Anybody?
Yeah, well, I think that I'm looking at Abraham and listening to Sarah. I think it's very important when I was looking for a home for myself, the first thing I looked was not kind of the house I want, but the neighborhood for my children and the school in the neighborhood. And so I can understand that Abraham, God sees Sarah's reasoning of not wanting Ishmael influence on Isaac and tells Abraham to listen to her.
Okay, all right. So you're showing an appreciation for Sarah having this concern. How is Isaac going to be influenced? Anybody else?
I find it interesting that in the first instance during the pregnancy, Abraham was willing to let Sarah do whatever she wanted, and he trusted her judgment and felt she would do the right thing. Whereas in this instance, where there are children involved, he really is waffling. He thinks she's maybe she's going a bit overboard with what she's seeing, and it's only when God steps in that he acts.
Okay, and you're pointing to something that, again, some commentators say that in fact, Avram, but as the expression goes, behind every great man, that Sarah, without her, perhaps none of this would have happened. Not just that there would be a child born, but yeah, Avram needed a little push to understand that this was ultimately going to be the right move. Absolutely. Anyone else?
It also strikes me, going back to Hagar despising Sarah. I hadn't thought of this before, but she could have been taking the son. She could have been taking the son and choosing to raise him so that he wouldn't be an heir. He would be the son of Abraham, but his whole value system and everything would be Hagar's.
And can you say a little more about that, Brenda?
Well, the implication then would be that he wouldn't be carrying on Abraham's line because what he was preaching would be lost. there wouldn't be that generation to carry on the traditions. The story wouldn't have been passed along if Hagar had been the primary force.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is how we set this up. That, of course, if you just read it at face value, it appears that Sarah, who we said cares so much about Avraham, how does she ask her husband to send away his own child? And he only has that child because she encouraged. Okay, now, on the other hand, is that going to, and this is going to be a topic for discussion before we conclude today, is there ever a time that something like that can happen, that it appears to be cruel, but we don't have reason to believe that Sarah was doing it even for personal reasons alone? But if she had in mind, even more so than Avraham, that they have a role to play for Am Yisrael, and if she's feeling that Ishmael is going to have the wrong influence, and that there's no way he can inherit the position, then, you know, is there some justification for her doing that? Anyone?
Well, isn't that her mission, really, to build the nation?
Yes, but I'm saying there are people who will read this and say, I have a problem with this story. Because how can Sarah, our matriarch, appear to be doing something cruel? And this is an example of what I was referring to, that somebody who doesn't appreciate enough the role that Avraham and Sarah were to play in building this nation, and having to know who are the right players, won't like this. Now,
but to me, it's like people who don't understand the principle of the law. You know, there are certain laws that you're not allowed to break, right? For the good of the people. Like you're not allowed to murder.
yes.
But sometimes you are allowed.
Well, okay. And she's not telling him to murder here, but even something as telling your husband to send his child away. So now,
sometimes the wrong is justified, is what I'm trying to say.
okay, well, yeah. So I think, saying something similar. Now, this doesn't mean you don't get to say, this is problematic. You know, it's not just a great story. It's not to bring us joy that a child is sent away. No, but that perhaps sometimes is necessary. Perhaps. Okay, we'll keep that in mind as we move on. And we ask, who was Avraham? And Rambam, Maimonides, begins to answer this by telling us the following. Though he was a child, Abraham began to think incessantly throughout the day and night, wondering, how is it possible for the sphere, the world, to continue to revolve without having anyone controlling it? Who is causing it to revolve? Surely it does not cause itself to revolve. Avram had no teacher, nor was there anyone to inform him. Rather, he was mired in Ur-Kasdim among the foolish idolaters. His father, mother, and all the people around him were idol worshipers, and he would worship with them. However, his heart was exploring and gaining understanding. Ultimately, He appreciated the way of truth and understood the path of righteousness through his accurate comprehension. He realized that there was one God who controlled the sphere, that he created everything, and that there is no other God among all other entities. He knew that the entire world was making a mistake. What caused him to err was their service of the stars and images, which made them lose awareness of the truth. Abraham was 40 years old when he became aware of his creator. When he recognized and knew him, he began to formulate replies to the inhabitants of Ur Kasdim and debate with them, telling them that they were not following a proper path. So Rambam is trying to tell us that from day one, even as a child, Avraham was thinking, and he needed rational answers to how the world was existing. And he lived in a time where nobody else believed this, and he started making the case. Now, it's said that Avraham went through 10 tests, 10 trials in his lifetime, perhaps 11. We'll get to that. And the first is told in this midrash, because Avraham was going around trying to convince people. So Terach, who was also not a believer, took his son Abraham and handed him over to Nimrod, the king of the land in Mesopotamia. For Abraham had opposed Nimrod's belief in idols. Nimrod said to him, "Let us worship fire. We should bow to none other than the fire." But you, Avram, refused to do so. I shall therefore cast you in it, and let your God to whom you bow come and save you from it. Abraham went into the furnace and survived with God's miraculous assistance. So that is considered the first trial that he went through. Now, the next trial, Lech Lecha. And the Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your land and from your birthplace and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will aggrandize your name, and I will show you to be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And all the families of the earth shall be blessed in you." Now, this is a trial, and what we just read about going into the furnace is a trial. Which of these two trials would you consider the harder one?
The fire.
The fire? Everybody agree?
No,
Okay.
Lech Lecha,
Who said that?
Julia.
Julia, why? You like fire?
Sorry?
You like fire?
I think that the Lech Lecha is taking him from such a place of comfort, of security, and the degrees in which he's commanded, me artzachar, from your land, that mi moladitecha, from your birthplace, mi bet avicha, from the, it's so crucial that God gives him this command in 3 stages, from the easiest to the hardest, building up his confidence to actually lech.
Thank you. Thank you. Logic tells us that if you are testing someone with a series of tests. Each one will be more difficult than the preceding one.
Right.
For if a person withstands a difficult test, you won't then test him with an easier one.
No. true.
So I ask you, and I'm glad Julia responded the way she did. So how is changing his place of residence harder than risking his life? Now, Julia said, Lech Lecha is hard because you're changing your residence. But why is it harder? Well, not necessarily more difficult in physical suffering, but rather in the mental effort. Now that also might sound strange. Wasn't deciding to go into the risky furnace more difficult mentally too? Anybody have a response to that? Because
I am talking from personal experience. For me, moving from one place to the other, where I didn't know anybody or the language, I had a choice. I can look at it as an adventure, or I can look at it as a hardship. I'm living wonderful family, I'm living wonderful position, and going into the unknown. Yet with a fire, you don't see a possibility. When you move, there's still a hope. Where there is life, there is hope. There is hope that the new place will bring something better for you.
okay, now what you're saying though is that you would still think of the fire as being the harsher. But
yes,
it's known, the comment, that each of these trials, and we're not going to discuss them all, becomes increasingly more difficult. So now,
but don't you have to go?
Julia, can I ask you to say a little bit more about why you think this one is harder? It's hard leaving something you're comfortable in, but would you not prefer that than risking your life?
Once you've risked your life, that's it. You're done. It's over. This is the beginning of a whole new future.
Wow. Okay. Julia, you should know that many commentators follow in your belief. What they suggest is, even though God promises Avraham here a few times that it's all going to be for a blessing, he doesn't know where he's going. He does not know what the destination is, and he's not sure why. Couldn't he have started this nation back at home? But it's suggested, while suffering martyrdom, because that's what it would have been, for him to die al Kiddush Hashem by going into that furnace because he wasn't willing to neglect God and follow Nimrod. While that is obviously physically more difficult, but when a person chooses to die, and he chose al Kiddush Hashem, he or she knows why he is doing it. I'm going to say that again. They say Avraham didn't really get why he had to make this great move. But when a person chooses to die al Kiddush Hashem, and like the martyrs that we mention on Yom Kippur, he or she knows why they are doing it. They know for what purpose he is or she is giving their life. Now, I mentioned that there's an 11th trial after what we consider the most demanding trial, but you know that after Yitzchak does not get bound and offered up, what's the next trial? We learn that Sarah dies, whether when she finds out, her heart is weak. But what does Avraham then have to do for this woman that he has spent his life with, building, so much with, it's suggested by Rabbi Jonah Grundy that at the beginning of Chaya Sarah, Avraham has to search for a burial spot for his wife. And there's negotiating and it's not going easily. And this Durandi says that what was so difficult about that is he had to get back to the mundane. He just lost his wife. He's gone through the episode with Yitzchak. He's still trying to build this nation. And sometimes the crisis is easier, as Julia said, that, you're involved in that and you die. But sometimes for people, it's the difficulties that are drop by drop, that can be harder to handle. It might sound strange, but I think we all know what I'm talking about, that sometimes a crisis going on and daily can be more difficult than when you're involved in a one-time crisis. An interesting way of looking at it. But certainly, he could not have peace of mind not knowing where he was going. And it's hard as I'm describing this. Yes, Linda.
None of us know where we're going. You set out and you think that you have a plan in mind and you think you know, but it always, so I really disagree with this, where I
No,
think.
but what are you disagreeing with? Because I would say that you saying that because many of these incidents prefigure actions or events that are going to happen to all of us throughout life. So what are you disagreeing with? Be exact.
I disagree with it being more challenging, even though he knows that he's going to burn to death, or supposedly, which in the end he doesn't, but he thinks he is. So I think stepping into the fire and expecting death is more difficult than taking a journey that you do not know where it's going.
Okay.
Yep.
Anybody else want to respond to that?
Gloria.
I'm a devil's advocate, but I think that it's like you're stepping into a vortex. He knows, as somebody said, if he steps into the fire, he's burnt to death, end of story. Whereas this way, he's got all the responsibilities and the experiences that he's had, and he's going off into a vortex. He doesn't know where he's going, how he's going to get there, how long it will take. Will God take care of him the entire time? Is his faith strong enough to believe that God will take care of him and that will lead him on the right path, and it's all going to work out well for him and for all the generations to come? Doesn't know that. And I think that would be very scary, because you don't know. There isn't a textbook to read about it or a map to follow. He's just listening to what God's telling him. I think that's very scary.
Yeah, and I don't think that takes away from what Linda's suggesting, that we all don't know what's going to happen, but to survive every day, we need to feel that we know we're going here tomorrow, we're doing this tomorrow. So we have that kind of a sense. He didn't know that.
But what he did know is that God promised he would be the father of a great nation. So therefore he would survive the fire.
Yeah.
Great, Simone. Okay. And
I think that the 11th trial is probably the most difficult one for Avraham. I think it combines not only stepping into the fire, but also lech lecha, because here he is in a after the death of Sarah, he's in a situation where he has to face the unknown. He doesn't really know what's going to happen to him, and he has to do it without his life partner upon whom he relied.
Yefeh. And unfortunately, Marlene speaks from experience, going through much of life without her beloved partner. Yeah, okay, even if there were different missions. Now, obviously, the key trial that we're not getting, I planned it perfectly because I didn't want to have to get into, not really, but the 10th trial, the Akedah. And if we said that picturing Avraham throwing out Ishmael is difficult, of course, people have a great problem with this. For our purposes, though, and our discussion about the role of Avraham and Sarah as parents and as parents of a nation, Rav Adin Steinzel says the following. The 10th trial, the Akedah, is the most difficult trial of them all. It is many times more difficult than the previous trials because it requires, now listen very carefully, it requires that Abraham do two things at once. First, he must kill his son Isaac, who is your son, your only son, whom you love, and who is also the offspring promised him by God. Second, he must perform an act that is far more serious and difficult beyond the private personal crisis of losing his only son. I'm going to read that again. Second, he must perform an act that is far more serious and difficult beyond the private personal crisis of losing his only son. It is the ultimate crisis of faith for Abraham. He must kill and sacrifice a human being, something that Abraham has stood against all his life. For God's sake, we know how he pleaded for a people not part of his own people, Sodom. And here he's willing to give his child, offer him up. Now, but let's not say now that he has assurance that he'll be okay. But what I find about what Steinsaltz is saying here, as if the issue of Avram having such faith in God, that was more problematic, that he was maybe going to have to go against his entire being of thinking of others and justice, that's going to be more difficult for him than what he says, the private personal crisis of losing a child. And that says it all to me. And that for him, Avram, his role was more of a parent of the nation. Esther.
Yeah, to me, there's another thing. He'll have to face his wife.
And that's the biggest trial of all, huh?
I'm saying you gave two very good reasons of what he's going through, and I'm adding a third one. He'll have to face his wife.
Very true.
Yeah, for sure. And that was the whole reason, if it had worked out that way, that she had sent away Ishmael. Now, when we are saying our prayers and we say Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and Sarah, we still say that. So I'm imagining that we all don't take any of these flaws, if we see them as flaws, to tell us we're throwing those ancestors out. And that's what Dr. Michael Rosenak wants for us, to feel that we can discuss these characters in this way, honestly, and with these kinds of questions. And he began with, what are we going to want our children to think of when they think of Avram and Sarah? I don't want them to just think of Sarah as the ideal Jewish woman, as she is considered, with the challah and the generosity and the modesty. But that there's more to her, because there's more to life. There's more to life than that.